Hey everyone, Matthew Kent, Theology on the Ground, coming at you today out of Luke chapter 20. I'm going to start in verse 41. But he, Jesus, said to them, "How can they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool.' David thus calls him Lord. So how is he his son?" Okay, so a little bit of background here that we need to cover, and I think I covered this in another video, but it's important. So the proper name of God, the thing with which God says in Isaiah, "This is my name," we would say Yahweh. We don't know exactly how to pronounce it. Um, in Hebrew, they write without vowels, and then eventually later on they had a system where they would, sort of put these dots to indicate where the vowels were. But the letters of the alphabet, they write just with the consonants. So the essentially the equivalent letters of YHWH in English are how God's name was spelled in the Old Testament. So Yahweh, or we sometimes alliterate it Jehovah, but it could be pronounced Yahweh or something like that. We don't know exactly how to pronounce it. You'll hear those four letters referred to as the Tetragrammaton, which is a huge word that basically just means a four-letter word. And so that's the proper name of God. When God says, "This is my name," that's the name that he uses, and it's the title that is most frequently used to refer to him in the Old Testament. Now, there's two other words that are very, 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 very frequently used. One of them being El or Elohim, which means God, and the other one would be Adonai, which is Lord. And so what ended up happening is out of an obligation to keep the commandment not to take the Lord's name in vain, basically they just stopped saying the name of Yahweh. So when they read their Bible, instead of saying Yahweh when they got there, they'd say Adonai. And so it's for this reason in the Old Testament, when we read it, that if you ever see the proper name of God, Yahweh, in your Old Testament, usually how they put it is the word Lord in all capitals. And so when you see all capitals, it means, hey, the name Yahweh is here, but we're just putting it Lord because this is one of the other common titles for God. Now, if you were to read this quotation from the Old Testament where Jesus was quoting from Psalm 110, Psalm 110:1, it's one of the most frequently quoted passages from the Old Testament by the New Testament. I think it is the most frequently quoted. And actually, ironically, in my Bible in a Year plan, I read this passage twice from Psalms quoted in the New Testament, here in Luke 20, and then I was also in the back half of Hebrews 1, where this same verse is also quoted. "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand." If you look it up, though, in the Old Testament, in Psalms, you'll see that that first Lord is in all caps. So in other words, this should read that David is saying, in Psalm 110, David is saying, "Yahweh said to my Lord." And so here in Luke, what Jesus is saying is he's saying, hey, think about what David said in Psalm 110. David was pointing to the Christ, that second Lord, the one with the normal capitalization, capital L, lowercase O-R-D. That second Lord is referring to the Christ. The Christ is David's Lord, right? David was king. He was, the top dog in Israel, but the Christ was still his Lord. And so, in that passage, essentially, Jesus is saying that, hey, David was saying, Yahweh said to my, David's, Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool at your feet. So that was said to Jesus. Yahweh said to Jesus, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool at your feet. And the New Testament consistently applies that to Jesus. Hebrews, which I was reading earlier, applied that to Jesus. And so what Jesus' point here is look, and he's not saying no that the Christ is not David's son. What he's trying to point at here is even though Jesus himself was a descendant of David according to the flesh, both through his adopted father Joseph and also through his biological mother Mary, so he was a descendant of David. He was a son of David, but in a very real way, he existed before David. So very similar to in John, where Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." It's the same kind of thing here. He's trying to point them to the fact that, hey, the Christ isn't just another dude. It's not just some chosen one who's just a man who has achieved favor with God, like the cults would teach us about Jesus. That no, the Christ is the eternal second person of the Trinity, and he is David's Lord, just like the Lord Yahweh is David's Lord, and so both of them can rightfully be referred to as Lord. So it's just an incredibly thought-provoking passage that Jesus would do that. I mean, if Jesus is not God, what he just said there was blasphemous. But Jesus is God, the eternal second person of the Trinity. I wanted to go over that one as my thought for my quiet time today. It's a bit of an educational one. Hopefully, I just remember somebody coming to me one time about 8 or 9 years ago that was confused by that passage. It's confusing reading it in the New Testament because both Lords are in all lowercase, and the Lord said to my Lord, what does that even mean? And I think even when I was explaining it, it's confusing because, from the perspective of David, this is being spoken, but then Jesus is quoting it, and what is Jesus saying about himself? Hopefully you followed it. Read Psalm 110. Read that passage from Luke 20, starting in verse 41. And hopefully you can see what I'm talking about. Hopefully this video was useful to you. And I look forward to talking to you guys again tomorrow. Blessings.